A lot of different figures get thrown around when it comes to how much do you need for a house deposit. Is it 5%, is it 10%, or even 20%? And then you have terminology such as LMI, lender's mortgage insurance, you've got credit limits, borrowing power, and it can all get quite confusing. Well, today I want to cover all these things and give my opinion on how much you should have for a house deposit, particularly in Australia, and what the ramifications will be of being under that 20% that you hear about, and why that might not be the end of the world. Hello everyone, I am Ethan Rushock, and on today's video I'll be talking to you about how much do you need for a house deposit, and in particular in Australia. So as I briefly discussed there's lots of figures that get thrown around when it comes to this topic, so I just want to give you my opinion and talk about some of the different scenarios that will happen depending on how much your deposit is. So the kind of three main areas that you've got to consider here, and I feel like you've got to step them through step by step to understand how much your deposit really needs to be. The first thing you really need to have some idea of is how much is the house you want to buy. So go on realestate.com or do a search around your local town or area that you're looking to buy in, and just have an idea of what the prices are of the houses you're wanting to buy. Get a price range, and this will be a great starting point. Because you first need to calculate what your borrowing power will actually be. So you need to have an idea of, is the house that you're looking at realistic based on your borrowing power? So let's say for instance we go, okay, the house that I want to buy is 500 grand. And then you start to go, okay, the next step is to work out, can you actually borrow that? So you go on to, there's lots of calculators on any of the bank websites, and you can get an idea of what your borrowing power will be based on your income and other assets, etc. You need to be very careful here though, because some of these borrowing power calculators can show you being able to borrow quite a lot of money. So you might go on there and you go, oh sweet, I can borrow $1 million based on my income. But then when you actually start to break it down, you might not be able to afford that. So be realistic, find the house first of what you're thinking you want to buy, and then see if the borrowing calculator backs that up. Alright, so now you've come up with an idea of approximately how much the house is you want to borrow. Before you go and calculate your deposit, I think you want to just check to see whether this is affordable for you. So it's what I briefly touched on, is that you might have a borrowing limit, but that might not be realistic once you work out the repayments on that. There's a lot of free repayment calculators online, so as you can see from this one here, you can just punch in your house amount, what your deposit will be, which we'll kind of work that out next, but then just work out if you took a loan out for that amount, what the repayments will be. So then what you're wanting to look at is, are your repayments realistic based on your current earning and current budget? Not everyone that's earning the same amount of money will have the same amount of expenses. So it's not a one size fits all here. I might be able to earn $2,000 a week and I can afford to repay a certain amount, and you might be earning the same, but you might have less expenses, so you might be able to actually spend more than me when it comes to your house. I think a really good way to look at it is go, okay, if you're already paying rent, what is your rent plus whatever you're saving for your deposit? Is that going to be more or less than what the repayments will be on the house? So for instance, in the small town that I live in, sometimes the rent figures are much higher than what a home loan repayment would be. So you know in your head that, okay, I'll easily be able to afford that repayment because I'm already paying that in rent alone. Now obviously if you're not paying rent, you're probably saving more because you might be, say, living at home with your parents and paying a small amount of board, or living with a friend and just paying them a small amount. So obviously here you probably want to compare what your savings are versus maybe if you are paying board or something, and just see whether that will cover the loan repayments. A bit of a rule that people do talk about is having your mortgage repayments being less than 30% of your net income. So this is just something that you can calculate, really easy to calculate and work out, look, how much are my repayments going to be? Because the banks will use formulas like this to work out whether it is affordable for you. Just a quick break before I jump into the next part of the video. If this is your first time being here, thank you. I'm glad you've come here. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you want to see more videos about personal finance, investing, properties. And make sure you hit that like button because it really helps me grow this channel. Thank you, and let's get back into the video. All right, so now you've worked out how much your house is that you want to buy, you can afford the repayments, and now it's just time to work out how much do you actually need for this deposit. So the reason why so many figures get thrown around is there's actually a lot of different levels of how much you'd need depending on what you're trying to achieve. So probably the lowest amount you'd ever need would be 5%. Not many banks will loan more than 95% of the property value. So that's why you need that at least 5% deposit. But then you also need to cover fees on top of this. So quite often you'll need to cover stamp duty or LMI, depending on what bank you're with, which I'll get into that in a minute. But you need to cover those so you've got that 5% down payment of the house value. Now the reason why people talk about the 20% deposit is because this is the amount you need to avoid LMI. So LMI is lender's mortgage insurance. So this is really an insurance the bank takes out to cover you because they deem it as a higher risk borrowing, because obviously you're borrowing close to the full amount of the property. So therefore, if suddenly you lose your job and you can't afford to repay it, the bank want to cover themselves a bit here. Now LMI can be really expensive, so I'll jump into a quick calculator here. So we'll say with a $500,000 house. Now obviously you can have different levels of what the LVR, which is the loan to value ratio, but let's go say first of all a 95% borrow. And you can see here it's nearly $17,500 LMI, so this is an extra fee you will pay. Now if we drop it down here, we can go to say an 85% LVR, and suddenly that drops to less than $5,000. So you can see saving those extra dollars for the deposit can make a huge difference to the LVR. And then obviously if you can drop that down to less than 80%, this becomes zero. So you can see that extra 15%, so between a 5% and a 20% deposit, you're saving yourself $17,500 there in fees that are just fees that you'll never get back. So clearly there's a lot of benefit in saving that 20% deposit. I really think that is what you should be aiming for in 95% of situations, because that will avoid LMI. Now there are a couple of situations where I wouldn't be too bothered by LMI. And that is one, if you find such a good buy that you feel like it's discounted so much that you're willing to pay that insurance. So if you come across a house and you notice that it's $100,000 less than what you think it's worth, it might be worth jumping in at a 90% lend rather than waiting till you get to that 80%, because you might be actually saving so much on the value of the house that those extra fees you pay are worth it. The other situation would be if you're actually buying into a really high growth area, which is obviously going to be really hard to predict, but the value of the house may actually go up quite significantly in say the 2-year period that you were going to work on to save that higher deposit. So in this case, the growth in that time may actually offset what that LMI fees would have been. Obviously that's a very hard thing to predict, but it is something that you could consider, that if you're really deciding you found the right home and you thought, oh look, this is a really good growth area, I believe, that it might be worthwhile to jump in then rather than wait till you've got that full 20% deposit. I think overall it comes down to trying to save the biggest deposit you can and aiming for that 20%. If you get to 17%, at least it's better than 5%, for instance. And don't just borrow the maximum available. Make sure you're considering, is this house really what I need? Do I really need to get that extra bedroom that I'm not going to use, for instance? Buy within your means, and therefore you'll be able to afford the repayments on it and not over borrow and be really stressed by the biggest size of your mortgage. And as I just said, if you have to pay LMI, it's not the end of the world. Don't stress that if the perfect property comes up that you're going to pay a little bit of LMI, because it might work out better for you in the long run. Today's question of the day is, did you pay LMI when buying your house? I would really be interesting to find whether people have just jumped in because they've found the right situation and been happy to pay that LMI, or whether people are still saving for that deposit because they're wanting to avoid the LMI. If you're buying for an investment property, make sure you check out a couple of my videos here coming up on different tips for maximizing the profit you make off your investment property. I thank you for being here, and I'll see you on the next video.